Good evening, y'all. After 20 weeks of doing regular electronics classes on Sunday nights, and this being the first full week I'm back at my day job, and with a socially distanced social event this week, I have decided to take a Sunday night off from my regularly scheduled Electronics Bash class. But, given that the next topic that I hope we'll talk about is the Raspberry Pi single board computer, I thought I'd leave you with a short video on the materials and supplies you would need if you wanted to start playing around with a Raspberry Pi. First, obviously, you'll need a Raspberry Pi board. We are currently on the Raspberry Pi version 4, and there have been more than 4 versions over time. The 1, the 2, the 2B, and so on. If you're buying one new, all of the versions basically cost the same thing, so you might as well get the newest version. You'll notice the Raspberry Pi 4 comes in versions with different amounts of RAM, 1, 2, 4, and 8 gigabytes. I picked a 2 gigabyte one. 1 gigabyte would be plenty to play around with. 8 gigabytes is really only necessary if you're going to be doing something really graphics intensive or processor heavy, so if you're just getting this to play around with, I wouldn't worry about that too much. The next thing you'll need is a power supply to get the board turned on, and this is an area where I recommend that you do not skimp. I have used this little janky power supply to power this old Raspberry Pi 2B for a long time to control my 3D printer, and it's not always great. When you underpower a Raspberry Pi, which is essentially a small computer, bad things can happen. So I recommend getting a nice, in the case of the Raspberry Pi 2 and 3, a 2 amp micro USB power supply. For the Raspberry Pi 4, they've gone to a USB-C connector and recommend at least a 3 amp or a 15 watt power supply. This one that I'm going to use, I think, cost me $8. And it's worth it to know that I'm going to have reliable power to the computer. You'll also need a micro SD card to load the operating system onto. This one is 16 gigabytes. You could make do with 8, but again, they're a relatively cheap part. You'll also need some way to connect this micro SD card to an existing computer, either PC or Mac, to load the operating system onto it initially, but having the ability to edit things on a micro SD card is cheap and easy with something like this little USB micro SD card reader. You'll also want a USB keyboard and mouse to control the device, and the appropriate HDMI cables for your version of the Raspberry Pi. Ooh. If you're using a Raspberry Pi 4, what you want is a micro HDMI to, say, full-size HDMI to plug into your monitor. Older versions of the Raspberry Pi, though, had either mini HDMI or full-size HDMI, so if you are using an older Pi, make sure you get the cables that are right for your system. Finally, while the Raspberry Pi 4 does have built-in Wi-Fi, it's sometimes useful to be able to hardwire your connection to a network or the internet, so an Ethernet cable can be helpful. Also, versions earlier than the Pi 4 did not have built-in Wi-Fi, so if you're using one of them, something like this little USB to Wi-Fi adapter might come in handy. You may also notice these little Raspberry Pi Zero W boards floating around. They're like a smaller version of the Pi with built-in Wi-Fi, and they're super cheap, but you'll notice they don't have a lot of the useful connectors like USB and Ethernet that the full-size Pis have, so for experimentation, I would recommend a full-size Raspberry Pi board of some version. And that's about all you'll need to get started. I'm sorry that I'm missing this Sunday night, but honestly, a little sleep will do me a lot of good. The only thing I have left to say is that this week I am drinking a tasty Little Buddy lager from Hopewell Brewery. I hope you are drinking something tasty as well, or at least staying hydrated. Thanks, y'all. Stay safe out there, stay healthy, and I will see you next Sunday.